So our next speaker is Chris Gerlinsky. This is his third time with us, I believe. The first one was in Montreal a few years ago, where he presented some really impressive research on hacking satellite and cable TV. He joined us in Brussels, and today he's here to talk about some adventures in encrypted ROMs.
Thanks. My name is Chris Gerlinsky. I'm a hacker living on Vancouver Island here in Canada. My background is in attacking secure systems. So I look at things generally from the perspective of an attacker, not a defender. As mentioned, a past project that I presented at RECON was about cracking satellite and cable pay TV. And in that project, I did an optical ROM extraction from a chip, disassembled it, analyzed that, and was able to glitch and extract the encryption keys. So today I'm going to talk about descrambling data from mask ROM. So just a little background on what I'm talking about here. Mask ROM is the read-only memory that's in the chip, and it's defined during production of the IC. It's actually physically embedded inside of the chip. It's not stored just as electrons inside the chip, but it's actually a physical structure that exists inside the chip. It's the most dense of the memory structures that you can produce on a chip. So it's desirable from a standpoint of space that's used on the chip. A boot ROM is a common use of it. That's a ROM that will execute as soon as you reset a chip before it even runs any of the user code inside of the chip. These boot ROMs are usually quite small, like a few kilobytes, and they're interesting to look at because as an attacker, if you can exploit the boot ROM, then you have a way to exploit that platform without even worrying about the actual user software that's inside of that chip. So for optically extracting ROM data, the first point is that it can be observed with a microscope. The bit encodings are a physical thing that exists on the chip, so it could be encoded as a piece of metal, whether there's a metal link or not, or it could also be encoded based on whether there's an active transistor or not at that spot in the ROM matrix. So I've talked a bit before about the ROM extraction process at Hardware I/O a couple weeks ago. There's also other presentations and blog posts and such about optical ROM extraction. It's not really anything new. If you're interested in some nice pictures and descriptions of different people's projects that they've done on ROM extraction, there's a list of them here. The first site listed there, Silicon Prawn. If you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out. It's a great open resource for reverse engineering hardware. There's not a lot of that information online, so it's a great resource to have. Also, you can see there's a talk from RECON here a few years ago where there's a few guys on a team that reverse engineered the Nintendo 64 security chip, and that involved ROM extraction also. So this is what ROM looks like. It can look different depending on the actual design of it inside of the chip. The main point, though, is that we're able to see a difference between a bit that's in a 1 state or a 0 state. So that could be depending on how the transistors are laid out, or whether there's a metal link there or not, or the top right image, we can see that's an implant ROM that's been selectively etched so that the active transistors are dark while the others are light. Sometimes you might need to use an electron microscope for imaging. The scale of chips is getting so small. I've done a lot of work with the optical imaging, starting to do some more work with the electron microscope images. At this point, both of them can be valid depending on the chip that you're looking at. So for extracting the bits out of the images, I have a software program that I developed to help me with this. It relies just on the bits being in a large grid. They're at very even locations within the grid. So I look at the grid, I look, is there a light spot or a dark spot at this point on the grid? And that's generally enough to be able to identify is it a 1 or a 0 bit. So the first stage, I run it through this software, and my output from this software is just a text file with a series of 1, 0, 1, 1, and so on. Then I have another software program at the top of this slide, which allows me to visualize the data that I've extracted from the chip and select some options for how I want to convert those bits into bytes to actually get a hex file that I can do something with. The picture at the bottom is another electron microscope picture of a ROM from a chip, and that just has some labels written on it after the fact for us to know what were the correct options for exporting bits from this chip. We can see on this one the bit 31 is on the left-hand column, and they go down to bit 0 on the right. If there's a white dot, that means it's a 0 bit. A black dot means it's a 1 bit. It's quite straightforward in this case. So to determine this bit layout and how to organize the bits into bytes, there's a few clues that we can start to look at. The first one is that normally the ROM is organized in a quite sensible manner. It typically is very direct, it's very linear. You start at address 0 and you continue to the end. In most cases, when you look at a ROM inside of a chip, it's going to be a very straightforward mapping from bits into bytes. Inside of the ROM, each of the 8 or 16 or 32 bits is going to have its own output onto the data bus. So all of your bit 0 for each byte will be bunched together, and in another column you'll have your bit 1, and in another column your bit 2, and so on. The rows and columns that the bits are arranged in are typically in order. That is, with the least significant bits addressing the column within your image, and the most significant bits addressing the row. There'll be another image where you can see a bit closer coming up. And also, a lot of the time around the periphery of the ROM, you're able to see with the address and data connections and where they link onto a bus. And in some cases, those connections to the bus can be visible, and that can also give you some clues about how the ROM is organized. So here's an example image of a ROM. We can see there's 8 columns of bits. All of the bit 0 is in the left column. All of the bit 7s are in the right column. Each of these columns, there's 8 bytes within each row. So they're using the low 3 address bits to select which column to read from, and then the other address bits are selecting the row. And we can see at the bottom where the output is for this chip, there's a sort of a triangular pattern, and we can see that in one direction it's ascending, in the other direction it's descending. So for bit 0, our bits are ordered 0 through 7, and then the next column it's actually mirrored, so the bits are ordered 7 through 0. This system of having certain columns being mirrored is quite common inside of the chips. It's a structure that you see a lot. So as well as going from 0 to 7, you also want to keep your eyes open for situations where there might be things mirrored, where half of it is going in one order and the other half reverses the order. But that's still quite easy to spot usually. So for encrypted ROMs. Now, the issue is that ROM contents can be observed via a microscope. So what's the solution? Encrypt the ROM data. There are some constraints for that, though. The encryption is slow if it's good, and you don't want to use a lot of space on the chip. So a compromise that is typically made is to just scramble the bits within the ROM instead of actually using a strong encryption. So the data inside of ROM isn't really encrypted, it's just in an order that's a little bit hard to decipher. And to repeat some of the problems with encrypting ROM, performance is a really big one. Anytime that you need to fetch a byte from ROM, which is for every instruction that's executed when you're executing from ROM, you need to be able to decrypt that byte. And you need to be able to select any arbitrary address and decrypt that byte. So if your decryption process takes any time at all, now you've slowed down your chip for every instruction that's executed based on that decryption time. Power consumption is another really big issue. Especially in secure chips, a lot of the time secure chips are also used in low power situations, and power consumption is a really big deal. And the more complex your decryption is, the more power consumption you're going to have. Also the space used, the smaller you can make your chip, the more you can fit on a wafer, the cheaper your end design is. So there's a few issues that you need to balance with designing a ROM encryption that make it actually practical to use in the real world. So here's an example from an EM microelectronics chip. This one doesn't have scrambling on the ROM. At the top, we have an image that was taken with a focused ion beam. And we can see there's 4 columns of bits on the left, 4 columns of bits on the right. At the bottom, I have them labeled for the bit order. They're going directly 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the addressing within the columns is mirrored from one side to the other. So for the 4 sets of bits on the left, your addressing is going from 0 through 1F, left to right. On the right-hand side, it's reversed, so you're going right to left from 0 to 1F. So this doesn't, I wouldn't really consider this scrambling. This is just mirrored addressing. It's pretty direct. Once you extract the bits and you line them up in this order, you have a plain text ROM. Here's another example from the same manufacturer, from EM Microelectronics. This one is an encrypted ROM, or a scrambled ROM. Encryption is a bit of a strong phrase to use first thing this week, really. So this ROM has an 8-bit output. It's organized with 8 bytes per row. There's 137 rows of the ROM, which is hex 448 bytes, which is quite a weird number for a size of ROM. So that was the first clue that there's something unusual here, is that it has such a weirdly specific size. So this is a program that I use for manipulating the data once I've visually extracted it from ROM. This allows me to organize the bits in different directions and see the hex values of the bytes to know when I have something that makes sense. So the part that I have selected right now is near the beginning of the ROM, and you could see there were some patterns there, but it wasn't actually plain text code. Now if we look closer to the end of the ROM, we can see there's a large area that's all full of FFs. This match is on the left side. You can see the large block of black dots there. In this case, there appears to be some FFs that aren't grouped with each other. So I'm just selecting some different options in my program to interpret the ROM in a different way. Instead of running left to right addressing, I switch it right to left. And now our block of FFs is even longer, a longer contiguous block. So that's a good sign that the ordering could be right, because we get such a nice static block like that. And then after doing that, the next thing that I'm able to notice is there is an 8-byte sequence that appears to be plain text. That was a valid 8051 code. There was an infinite loop there, which is a pretty common thing to see at the end of code blocks. The ADFE is an infinite loop, followed by some long jumps. There's sort of a vector area. So there's 8 bytes that turned out in plain text, but the rest of it still isn't valid code at this point in this chip. Looking into it a little bit more, it was pretty obvious once we dug into it, because the full encryption on this ROM is an exclusive OR. They're taking 8 bytes of ROM, you exclusive OR that with the next 8 bytes, you invert that, or exclusive OR with FF, and your result of that is the plain text address. So if we take the first 8 bytes of ROM, we XOR that with the second 8 bytes, we invert, we get the plain text address. If we do that with the next 2 rows, we take the second 8 bytes, exclusive OR with the third 8 bytes, our result from that is the plain text address. So we can guess pretty easily that exclusive OR is something to try on this chip. We see visual patterns in there. That's a good sign that it's not a complex scramble. And exclusive OR is such a basic thing to check, right? That's your typical homebrew encryption. Who could ever reverse an exclusive OR? The other main pattern that showed up here was that there's the empty space that's all FFs near the end of the chip. And that doesn't show the exclusive OR pattern in it at all. If I look at the end of that block, remember there was the 8 bytes that were not encrypted. If I take those bytes and I exclusive OR with the neighboring bytes, then I do get the sequential bytes after that decrypted. So they're doing something a little bit funny with the exclusive OR here in the empty space, but you can XOR the other bytes together and you get your plain text. So looking into it a little bit more, what they did is they took their plaintext ROM, they exclusive ORed all of the 8-byte blocks together for all of the used code space, and they used that resulting value as their key for their XOR encryption on the ROM. So the very first 8 bytes of ROM, the key that they're going to use, is the result of exclusive ORing all of the used code space. And then as a side effect of that, when you encrypt to the end of code space, it ends up encrypting back to 0 at the end. So I don't know if they've done this intentionally, if it's just a way to try and hide the pattern of the XOR, because with a large area where you have all those FF bytes and you have a stat XOR applied, then you start to see a pattern from that. But yeah, they had this weird little side effect where your empty space, in this case, ended up being not encrypted, but that actually worked to give some clues for how to decrypt it. So just to review what we saw on this chip, the ROM is encrypted using a very strong 64-bit key, an exclusive OR. There was a clue to that. The unusual size, 448 bytes, is a really weird size for a ROM. It's almost always a round number. And so you have an extra 8 bytes for your encryption key in this case. The area that was all FFs, that was a little bit of a decoy at first. Looking at the ROM at first, it would have appeared to be not encrypted because you're seeing such a static block like this. But in this case, it's the side effect of the key that they chose. And the 8 bytes following FF resulted in not being encrypted. And that was a good clue, because seeing those 8 bytes that were valid 8051 code was a sign that things were pretty close, that it was going to be able to figure out exactly how to descramble the rest. Oh, another scrambled ROM to look at is an ST19 smart card ROM. So this one is scrambled a little bit more thoroughly. It's an implant ROM. Neither of those are really problems. I was able to image it and to decode it. Other people have also in the past. I'm not the only one who's worked on this chip. In these chips, you see checkerboard patterns that show through from the scramble that they use. So I've looked at 2 series of the ST19 chips. There's a K5 series, and the ROM on those is organized into 8 columns, and it has an 8-bit output. Or there's a K7 series, which is organized into 16 columns, but it is still an 8-bit output. So we have 2 sets of columns that are just paired up. For the scramble, they do some swapping of the rows and the bits and the bytes within the columns. And these chips, you can find them used in pay TV access systems, transportation payment for like the bus or whatever. Printer cartridges use these for copy protection. So starting out looking at one of these ST19 ROMs, this is what it looks like after removing the top layers of the chip with hydrofluoric acid. Zooming in a little bit, so we can see the rows and columns of bits, but we don't actually see any data there. It's a little bit of a fuzzy picture, but also there's no contrast between the bits. So, hello? Oh, after doing a selective etch on the ROM, a dash etch it's called. Now we have some contrast within the bits, and we can actually extract the bits visually from this image. Wider view after doing some contrast adjustments, and yeah. So in this case, the fact that it's implant ROM wasn't really a problem. You're still able to visually see the bits under the microscope. So after extracting the bits, we get patterns that start to look like this. So these are the extracted bits from one of the ST19 K5 series smart cards, and we can see, especially on the left-hand columns, you see some large blocks. And we can guess already that what they're doing is they're inverting bits in a pattern here. It's quite normal for some bits within your ROM. They'll tend to be 0 or 1. The way that the opcodes work out in most systems, the bits aren't distributed evenly, right? So you don't actually have random bits in different places. They'll tend to either be a 1 or a 0. So when you start to encrypt with these patterns, then these patterns show against your existing patterns. So I call this one the newer version because the same product, they had an older version of it, and the encrypted ROM looked like this. So here we have really nice, clear patterns. And we can guess already, just from how perfect these patterns are, that this is the inversion pattern that they apply to ROM, showing through an empty space within ROM. If we compare the older version to the newer version, this is supposed to be animated, but the animation doesn't run in the slideshow. If we compare the two together, we can see that the data in the middle is staying the same, while the above it and below it, all those empty areas are changing back and forth to different values. So essentially what they did is they realized that filling their empty space full of zeros was showing an encryption pattern through. So in the newer version of it, they fill with random data, and you totally lose the visible encryption patterns in those areas. But the actual code, the program code, was the same. There's some bits that you'll see flip in here. That's largely just optical extraction errors from working with not perfect pictures. So one of the pictures that isn't showing up here, unfortunately, for technical issues. If we look at the decrypted version of this ROM, then all the areas with the really black and white checkerboard areas, those actually did decrypt perfectly to 0. Those were just empty spaces, and then we have code in the rest of the space. So being able to visually see these patterns is the whole basis of how I'm descrambling these ROMs. There tends to be these sorts of visual patterns that'll show through, just because the simplicity of the methods that they're able to do for scrambling that, again, doesn't take any time for decryption and these sorts of issues. So that was an ST19K5. Now this is an ST19K7. This is the entire ROM from one of the chips. There's a little bit of color variation. That's just from starting and stopping the process of taking the photos with the microscope. There's a few holes in it. That's because this chip I delayered using hydrofluoric acid, and the wet etching process, you don't end up with a totally planar result. So I have some little holes where the acid etched a bit further. In this case, I don't consider it a really big deal. If I need full ROM extraction, I can repeat it on 2 different chips. Those holes are probably going to end up in different spots. That works quite well. Or another option is to get into polishing a chip instead of using the wet etching. So zooming in a little bit, we can see the 16 columns within this ROM, but we can see that they're paired up. Like the leftmost column repeats in the 8th column, and so on. That's what these arrows are pointing to. We can see the visual pattern repeats between the columns. So right away we can guess that, okay, this ROM that we're expecting to have an 8-bit output, there really are 8 bits of data stored in here. They just have it split into 2 halves. So looking at the patterns, and in this case, I did have some plain text available from some of these chips. These ST19 smart cards are used in a variety of systems, and some of them have been exploited in other methods, for example, glitching to extract code. So for some versions of these chips, I had pieces of plain text code, and by comparing the plain text code to these visual patterns, I wrote a program that all I'm doing is I'm reversing the visual patterns that I see. I didn't actually fundamentally understand the process that they were using on the scramble. I just went through column by column, and I reversed the patterns until I didn't see the scramble pattern anymore, and I lined things up to make them match up with the bit of plain text that I had. And because the pattern is consistent over the entire ROM, now the small piece of plain text that I had allows me to decrypt the rest. So this is just an example of the code that I use and how really basic and trivial it really was to write something just to reverse patterns. I wrote a few of these programs to swap bits around and to apply XOR patterns to them and this kind of thing. And then I chained them together in batch files. Like, this is a really primitive way to do a decryption of the memory, but it works. That's the bottom line, is that the visual patterns are enough that just reversing the visual patterns and chaining it together in this really hacky kind of way worked just fine. So on the first chip that I did, as I mentioned, I had some plain text to work with. But now that I've been able to figure out the scramble on one of them, it turns out that the scrambling across the whole family of ST19s is quite the same. So once you've broken one of them, then you can apply that to other versions of it, and you're able to decrypt those also. So again, here's an example from an Opus smart card. This is actually used locally for the transportation system here. You can load it up with credit for the bus or whatever. So at the top is the digitized version of the bits extracted from it. This is just a small piece of the ROM. There's a lot of visual patterns in this too, which is always a good sign when you're trying to descramble it. The visual patterns, besides showing up in areas where you have padding, that's all zeros or FFs or whatever, you tend to have a lot of data tables inside of code also. That's just the nature of writing code. So in this case, they have these data tables that include all this ASCII text on the right. So the patterns in the plain text make it easier to visualize the patterns in the scrambled bits. And then also, once you're descrambling, once you start to see this ASCII text, then you're pretty confident already that you have the descrambling correct, because you're not going to get valid ASCII text that's human readable if you don't have the bits organized in the right way. So in this case, I was able to do the research into the ROM scrambling on a different platform on a different product, and then I was basically able to rerun my series of scripts on the extracted data from this card and able to decrypt it no problem. So for an example of how basic this process can be, again, I'm not trying to claim that I have the secrets to be able to decrypt any possible kind of an encrypted ROM. I'm just saying that a lot of the ROM that would be considered encrypted is very poorly encrypted, and the visual patterns give really a lot away. So there's a couple of links here that have the scripts that I use for descrambling these ST19 K7 series ROMs, and then there's a few photos from this Opus chip if you're interested to try and actually extract the bits visually and run it through the process. So to summarize the ST19 ROM descrambling, the basics of the scrambling method is really the same between members within the same family. So within the K5 series, you have one set of scramble. Within the K7 series, from what I've seen, those chips all seem to have the same scramble. There were some differences between K5 and K7, but essentially the same concept. So once you've understood one, then you have a lot of clues to work towards the other series of the chips, newer or older. One of the big helpful things here was that the plaintext and the ciphertext versions were available for some of these cards. Some of them were used in pay TV, and a lot of those, the ROM dumps were posted online that hackers were able to obtain through glitching. So having the nice clean plaintext and being able to use that to manipulate the ciphertext was super useful. Also, the smart card that had the two different ROM versions, where one had a lot of empty space filled with 0 and the other had it filled with random data. That was also a nice clue for what was going on inside of the scramble. In my case, I actually extracted the bits from the newer version first, and I went to do a second one just to identify if I had any errors. And when I went to do the second one, I saw that it actually was a different ROM with all this empty space with the patterns showing through, and it would have been so much easier if I'd started with that one. So sometimes it's worthwhile to sort of look around at the different products because some of them might have more obvious patterns that you can look at. And in general, software has a pretty predictable layout in a lot of these chips. If it's a product that's getting released every so often, for example, the pay TV smart cards, every few years they do a refresh, but a lot of the time there's code that's shared between the different versions. So if you're familiar with the old version, you might have a pretty good idea of what to look for in the new version. Also things like jump tables and fixed entry points, those give you known data locations to look at to start descrambling stuff. And yeah, just to mention that this work on this ST19 ROM, I'm definitely not the first person to do it. Both of the K5 and K7 series of chips were extracted by pay TV hackers years ago. As far as I know, their specific techniques weren't published, but I assume they followed a similar path to what I did. And yeah, they were able to successfully extract the bits, and that was used in the pirate pay TV world back then. So some risks with trying to keep ROM data secure or secret. So the first one is the common hardware platform. If you're using the same chip as another product that is going to get hacked, then hackers are going to attack somebody else's product, and they're going to use that information to hack yours. Once they understand the underlying hardware platform, then suddenly anything that's using that same hardware platform becomes the low-hanging fruit, and it's very easy to extract. And so even if you weren't a very interesting target before, you might become a more interesting target just based on the hackers actually having knowledge of the hardware already. Also, the scrambling inside the ROM, a lot of the time the scramble, if you're looking at the raw binary image in a hex editor, it might look very indecipherable, but when you start to look at it visually on the ROM inside the chip, the visual patterns can really give a lot away a lot of the time. So it's very important to actually check and look that your scramble is scrambling enough that people aren't going to be able to just visually identify these patterns. So a more sophisticated attacker, instead of just doing it visually like this, might actually trace the logic for the address scrambling, or may trace through an entire decryption circuit. In these cases, I didn't have to. In my own experience extracting data from ROMs, it's more likely that they'll be simple than that they'll be complex. So a lot of the time that's not necessary, but at the same time it's also entirely possible to actually trace through that part of the circuits and do all the decoding that way. So the bottom line is it's tough to hide secrets in ROM. It's hard to hide secrets in chips in general, but ROM specifically, by its very nature, is meant to be readable. So you're sort of working against nature if you're trying to really hide things in ROM. So some other techniques besides the way that I've done it. So this is a paper from Cambridge University using microprobing on the data bus. So in this case, they extracted the ROM bits, which were scrambled, and then after that, they probed directly onto the data bus of the chip with needles, and they injected signals inside of the chip. So they would flip bits inside of ROM, and then they would see the results in the decryption, and they were able to use this to reverse the mapping tables. Essentially, it was an S-box on this chip, but it's a nice sort of an attack. This does require actually microprobing of the data bus on the chip that they use. They were able to connect directly with needles. You might need a focused ion beam or something if you're on a smaller technology chip. Or another option for decryption is to reverse engineer the entire memory decryption circuitry. So for example, TextPlained has their chip juice tool that will actually generate a netlist from SEM images of a chip. So essentially, they'll reverse engineer the entire chip and reverse it back to a netlist, and then from there you can start to run your encrypted ROM contents through a simulation of the hardware and have a simulated version of the hardware generate your decrypted data for you. So this requires some pretty comprehensive deprocessing of the IC and layer-by-layer imaging and some knowledge and tools. But this is a real attack that's being done today also. Or another decryption technique is probing directly, have the hardware do the decryption for you. So if you can follow the circuitry within the chip past the decryption block, and you can find locations to actually connect with needles, then you can physically probe and read out the decrypted data, have the hardware do the decryption for you. This picture here is a focused ion beam image from Chris Tarnowski. He's put 17 connections down. Each of those little circles, you can put a microprobing needle on, and those connect down to internal layers within the chip. So once you've analyzed the chip and found where to connect with the fib, you can basically rewire the chip in any way that you need to. So in this case, he's bypassed the anti-probing shield layer on top and drilled down to a lower layer and made connections. And he'll run the chip, and the chip will actually do the decryption, and you'll just read it off of the decrypted data bus. So this does require quite a bit of analysis of the IC, and then a fib is also a non-trivial cost also. But again, this is another attack that has been used successfully and is going on in the wild. So if you're interested in any of the slides from this, or the software that I use for extracting the bits, or my ST19 decryption scripts, which again, all this, you'll see if you look at my code, I'm clearly not a programmer, I'm a hacker. These are just simple tools to get the job done, but they do work, and that's my main point here, is that the ROM scrambling, just because a hardware vendor is telling you that the ROM scrambled are encrypted, you really need to double check that if you're going to rely on it, because a lot of the scrambling is so weak that you basically can just do it by eye. So that's what I have for today. I don't know if there's any questions.